All right, my English teacher friends. So in this writing workshop video, we're going to revisit argumentation. And just as an aside note, I made this specifically for my AP Language and Composition crew. It's a practice FRQ3. But if you're teaching argumentation at any on-level grade, then this works. So we're going to center our attention around the following quote: "There are no mistakes, just happy accidents." So a student said in my AP literature class this week, "Why is all the stuff that we study so damn depressing?" And I'm like, it's literature, you know? So I'm in the midst of putting together a happiness project for AP literature. I just posted that to my YouTube channel where we're taking a look at 15 happiness poems. And in AP language and in my other on-level classes, we are going to do similar happy pursuits. So I'm a little tired of, the dour and down, the Eeyore-esque topics that we sometimes study. So I'm all about happiness as we get into test prep and tackle the rest of our year. So I'll walk you through the prompt, and then as always, I'll do my Bob Ross composition routine and show you and your students how to compile a few introductions, and then we will write our body paragraphs together using my templates. So here's the prompt. Over the course of history, in a variety of contexts, the following quote from Bob Ross has held a great deal of truth and at times a certain degree of fallacy. There are no mistakes, just happy accidents. Write an essay in which you argue and explore the nature of this claim. So with all FRQ3 prompts that are centered around a quote, I have my students really unpack the diction. In order to make this fly, you got to focus on the nature of mistakes and accidents. Those are the two driving forces in this particular prompt. So the thesis should be anchored in the ideology of mistake making versus accidents and the difference between those two. And then in terms of the second premise, which we'll get to in just a second, the second premise is where my students offer their textual support. They can use pop culture, history, literature, whatever in terms of supporting their arguments. And we'll get into one of my favorite words for FRQ3, specificity. So it all comes down to specificity of example. So as always, I Bob Ross this for my students. The examples that you're going to see in this video are written by yours truly, and I often do that with my students. I position myself as the expert writer in the classroom, just like Bob Ross did. And I paint intros and I paint bodies with them. And I use templates just like Bob Ross did. He always used a heuristic called the wet on wet technique. And with my students, we either declare or invert the thesis, and body paragraphs, regardless of the expository mode, are always written syllogistically. So let's jump right in and ask the following question. So, how do I write the introduction paragraph? This is where kids stare at their blank sheet of paper or their blank screens and say, what does teacher want? What does teacher want? What does teacher want? And it becomes this guessing game of how they can appease us. And that should never be the case, but it is the case when we assign versus explicitly teach. So it's not a matter of what teacher wants, it's a matter of conducting good writing. So I give my students two templates, the declarative thesis and the inverted thesis. Just to unpack this a little bit, those that are familiar with my templates and my writing workshops know that for rhetorical analysis, my students will declare the thesis. For literary analysis, so all the FRQs on the AP literature exam, my students invert. For argument, persuasion, synthesis, and research, it's a 50-50 coin flip. It does not matter. It's just really, contingent upon how you want your tone to drop and then how you're going to position the thesis, whether you're going to say it first or you're going to say it last in the introduction. Sometimes if you say it first, it can come off as being rather brusque and abrupt, a little like too impatient or something, like you're hostile. So you got to be very careful where you place it. So let's break down what these declarative and inverted thesis templates look like. So I have these triangles in my room, and I often make graphic organizers that are triangulated in shape. And what you can do is just begin with the thesis when you are declaring. So just boom, drop the thesis right out of the gate. Drop it like it's hot. From there, you're going to provide a little bit of context and background. Maybe you'll front load your textual support, just like name drop or something of that nature. Drop the seeds of your line of reasoning. And then here are two things that are really cool that my students do. Tier 2 level vocabulary. It's an academic paper, even though we're writing about Bob Ross, a Bob Ross quote. I do want to see a fair amount of academic diction, cop and academic tone. So I do intense word studies with my students. I have a word study academy that I run the entire course of the year. So by tier 2, I simply mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words, but you got to teeter-totter that. You don't want to totally geek out, nerd out, and just have this concept that if I use $1 million words, that it's the equivalent of good writing. This prompt does invite itself for a little colloquial, a little vernacular, and some tier 2. So I want to like teeter-totter that, and I'll demonstrate that for you. I think that's one key aspect to getting the unicorn point, the elusive sophistication point, is to oscillate those discourses. And then sentence constructs. I stole the following concept from Strunk and White in their seminal text called Write It Right. They have rule number 18, in which they assert that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So I will model for my students how to manipulate my syntax in the hopes of achieving voice rhythm and flow, something else that's essential to sophistication. And then always, 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 4 sentences long is an introductory paragraph when you're using my templates. So we can flip this on its head and end with the thesis. So in this way, you might begin with a hook, analogy, context, background, sprinkle in the tier 2, focus on those sentence constructs for the voice rhythm flow, exactly 4 sentences, but boop, thesis goes last in the 4th sentence. So let's take a look at 3 exemplars that I wrote. And the cool thing about this is that as I'm modeling this for students, as I'm Bob Rossing it, I can really give them a playbook for how to tackle their introduction, because I've done the assignment and I've worked out the kinks. I know what hurdles they're going to encounter, and I know what kind of hiccups or snafus are, indigenous to the prompt. So let me roll this with you. So again, pay attention to the tier 2, look for a little colloquial vernacular in there, and follow the sentence constructs, and then note where the thesis goes. Making mistakes is invaluable to the development of character and personal growth. Because of mistakes, one can make new things, try new things, learn, live fully, push oneself to honorable boundaries, change one's character for the better, and even change the world. But of greater importance, there can be no mistakes if the action behind the effort is well intended. History has offered us many characters who've made happy little accidents instead of mistakes. So I ended with the thesis here. And you can see that I'm front loading where I'm going in my body paragraphs. Many characters who've made happy little accidents instead of mistakes. So you have to get anchored in the diction of that prompt. And again, focus on accidents and mistakes. Those are the 2 key words. It's really going to be almost impossible to have a thesis without mentioning accidents and mistakes. You got to do it. So you do it first, or you do it last. It does not matter. But no, I'm not getting into my textual support yet. Don't want to do that. We're going to house all of that in the second premise. I'm just dropping seeds for the line of reasoning. So this second sentence has a nice complexity to it. It's pretty tricky. It reads well, flows well, and I think any AP reader would get to the end of this period here and say, wow, this is really good. If this student can carry this on for the duration of the essay, I might just be so inclined to give this kiddo the sophistication point. So this is how you execute it. Let me show you my second example. There are 2 types of people in this world, the doers and the do-nothings. So that's not a thesis statement yet, right? So I'm inverting. And here's what I'll disclose to you. I found it much easier to invert for this prompt than I did to declare. And oftentimes when there are quotes like the 2022 Colin Powell quote for FRQ3, all my exemplars that I wrote for that, I tended to invert. It just didn't sound right when I declared. So that's good stuff to know. When you have a quote, probably 9 times out of 10, you're going to invert. So I'll take this from the top again. There are 2 types of people in this world, the doers and the do-nothings. If you are a doer, that simply means that mistakes will be made. That is the basic nature of doing, learning, growing, experimenting until the mistake becomes a victory. Several professional athletes and seminal characters in literature prove this point. So again, I'm front-loading my line of reasoning. So expect a paragraph about an athlete, and then expect a paragraph about some literature characters. So since I said athlete first, first body paragraph. Since I said characters in literature second, second body paragraph. And off I go. I'm very, very organized. I definitely get the thesis point. Voice, rhythm, flow, vocabs up without being overkill, and very natural sounding. Very good. Number 3 is going to do the exact same thing. The very nature of wisdom is the learning of one's mistakes. Again, you have to focus on mistakes and accidents. To go forward to become a more evolved person, the real growth derives from a long series of trials and errors. Human nature, at its core essence, is a condition of proving our fallibility and flawed sense of being. Not only is this true of myself, but countless pivotal inventors who have gone on to change the world through a long succession of mistakes and happy accidents. So in this one, I'm not going to show it in this video, but I wanted to show my students how to write about themselves and kind of the catch of that, sort of the snafu of that. I find it better for a prompt like this to go historical, pop cultural, that route, literature route, than to talk about yourself. So I find when students talk about themselves, sometimes I read their writing and it's like LOL, OMG emojis all over the place. And I'm like, you're 16. You don't have the ethos quite yet of like a Thomas Edison or a Michael Jordan or an Ozzy Osbourne, if you want to go that route, right? So I think using outside examples is probably going to be a little bit better, a little stronger textual support than talking about the self. But I did model that for the students and left it to their own choice, their own doing. So we're done with intros. You got a sense of how to do that. All 3 of mine inverted, but that does not mean to say that all FRQ3s need to invert. It's just that prompt with that quote. I think it's easier to invert. Next question. How do I construct the body paragraphs? And for those that are familiar with my work, I always say this, proceed syllogistically. No matter if it's rhetorical analysis, literary analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, and even research, you can always bust out the syllogistic method. I know at this stage of the game that I'm pretty familiar with, most of you are familiar with me. There might be a couple of new ones that have joined me in this video. So I'll just give a cursory flyby of the syllogistic method. And if you want to do a deep dive into my lessons on inductive and deductive reasoning, just go rifling through my YouTube channel. There's plenty of stuff where I unpack the syllogistic method in more detail. So here it is in a quick synopsis, quick nutshell. The syllogistic method comes from the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle invented this when he was working at his school called the Lyceum, and the rich town boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling, and they would throw out these juicy, pithy questions like, what is justice? Which is at the core of a seminal text like Plato's Republic. And these great philosophical think tankers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle, just like us composition instructors, said, why are some of my kids so much better at orating their arguments than others? and he studied the real good orators, like the real good debaters. And one day he had a eureka moment and he said, aha, I got it. The kids are arguing syllogistically. And here's what he meant by that. There's a mathematical kind of computative precision, chronological order of logic. And it goes from premise to conclusion. So if I were to say premise number 1, arsenic is deadly, you would all say, yeah, we agree with that, Christian. And then if I were to say, yeah, but my dog ate arsenic in the second premise, we naturally conclude, the ill fate of the dog's going to die, right? That's cogent logic. That's cogent reasoning. And we want our students to be that exact in their line of reasoning when they write, no matter the expository mode. But when we get into FRQ3 or argument in general, students typically just drop the second premise. So they get into their source and they just tell the story of the source. And then maybe if we're lucky, they link it back to the prompt. But the kicker is this: we're writing argumentation. So we got to make sure that that first premise is arguing. So if we take that, template of premise, conclusion and give it a name for argumentation, this is what it looks like. And this is true for synthesis and research as well. Premise 1 is going to be an argument containing a why reason. Up top in the thesis, we don't get into our whys. We just drop the thesis without qualifying it. So we're going to get into our why reasons in the first premise. On FRQ1 AP Language, the College Board says 3 times, your argument must be central. I don't know why they don't say it on all 6 FRQs, because expository writing is an act of argumentation. So we're arguing. This is the argumentative paper, so we got to argue. So I tell my students, keep the centrality of your argument by taking 3 sentences to articulate your why reason. So this is not going to be a topic sentence. It's topic sentences, 3. Right? First premise is 3 sentences. Textual support comes from their noodles, their noggins. It comes right from their recall. And I'll show you how to do that in just a second and how to be very specific about it. And then the conclusion of the body paragraph. And I want to be really clear on this. Body paragraphs need conclusions. You just can't, drop your textual support and run like hell out of there. You got to really wrap it up. You got to link it back and echo the thesis and the prompt. So it all comes full circle on itself. In terms of moves, 3-sentence first premise. The total length of a syllogistic body paragraph is 10 to 12 sentences. So those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers aren't going to cut it on the exam or in college. This is not good writing. So you got to really flesh out your argument. So look at how I structure my first 3 sentences here. I have to get anchored in accidents and mistakes still. I have to stay anchored in that prompt. So check this out. Some of the world's most ingenious inventions that propelled humanity forward were wrought in thousands of happy accidents. Do you see how I'm in the prompt? If these great thinkers were to have been bogged down by the strivings of perfection, we would be without things like the automobile, telephone, even seemingly simple things such as the fork and spoon. But the thing is, there is such a thing as perfecting the fine art of making mistakes. So my argument here, my promise of the first premise is that you can make perfect mistakes, right? You can make perfect mistakes. That's what I'm going to argue. So now, starting in the 4th sentence, which triggers the shift, the transition into the second premise, I get into my example, and I'm going Thomas Edison. I bark at my kids when we get into the second premise for FRQ3. I'm like, specificity, get specific. I hate it when they're like, I'm going to talk about racism. Well, you got 7 sentences to talk about racism. It's too vague. It's too broad. I'm going to write about the civil rights movement. I'm going to write about World War II. I'm going to write about slavery. No. Really hone in on specifics, the minutia of something really, really specific. I think that's crucial. So look how detailed I get in this. It all comes from my head. I know enough about Thomas Edison to rip an essay about him. So this is all coming from my head. I didn't do any research on this whatsoever. So students, a lot of my students take AP US History, and that course tends to really segue nicely into second premises for FRQ3. So look where I go. An excellent example of this is Thomas Edison. So just a transition in that fourth sentence. He was one of the most successful innovators in American history, commonly referred to as the Wizard of Menlo Park, a larger-than-life figure who seemed to be able to construct miraculous things from the cosmos of his mind. But the man also stumbled sometimes tremendously, so stay anchored in that prompt. Don't stray from the thesis. In response to a question about his missteps, Edison once said, "I've not failed 10,000 times. I've successfully found 10,000 ways that will not work." From a historical perspective, most people are not aware of Edison's botched inventions. He would sometimes spend years turning the gears of one of his brainchildren, but to no avail in the end. And then I'm out of space here, so I'm going to go on to my next slide. Making mistakes is a matter of perspective, right? Anchor in the prompt. Edison did not hang his head and give up. He instead looked at the snags of his efforts and said, "Let's keep trying." By the end of his life, he had 1,093 inventions, including the phonograph, the motion picture camera, and the light bulb. In essence, his efforts gave birth to 1,093 inventions that spawned from the happy accidents of his mistakes. Again, anchor in that prompt. Now I got to go all the way back to the prompt and the thesis. Couple of sentences to wrap this up. Had Edison been of the mindset whereby he sought the perfect ideals of perfection, his name would have been forgotten many years ago. But instead, his legacy lives on because he recognized that mistakes can be a perfect impetus for creation and success. Traits like tenacity that allow one to never give up are the byproducts of happy accidents. This is at the core of wisdom and growth. And again, that took 12 sentences to do that. So again, you got to get really specific. I like this one in the sense that I knew my numbers, I knew my facts, and I want students to be that precise. I want them to choose textual support that they can shred and that they're the experts on. Otherwise, stay away from it. Avoid vagaries. You can talk about yourself, but again, I'm not a big fan of that. Not unless the prompt specifically asks you to write about yourself. I'm not a big fan on that. I think there's a million better ways to go. So the question is this: what do I do next? So I got a couple of emails this week. And I guess I failed to say this in my writing workshops, and I'm kind of remiss for that. My students do 4 paragraphs always on all 6 FRQs, Lang and Lit, 4 paragraphs, intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. So what do I do next? I just choose a different textual support. I just choose a different second premise and go with my why reason, 3 sentences. About 7 sentences, 6 sentences for my textual support, and wrap it up just like I did, and then throw a conclusion paragraph on it. 4 paragraphs, easy peasy. So I know a lot of my boys in class wrote about Michael Jordan, how he didn't make the JV team and he didn't give up and became one of the most prominent basketball players of all time. They knew that story inside and out. And so there's a ton of examples that you could use for this prompt. And maybe you want to do like a chalk talk, give each kid a marker, send them to your whiteboard and say, write down a couple of examples that you can think of to use for your second premise, like make a wall and have them just choose from those selections. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, reflections, or just want to reach out, you can contact me through my email address, which is teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Also note that I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. We always have some professional development going on. A lot of it's for free, some of it's at a nominal fee. But if you want to see the comings and goings of what I'm doing with the National Writing Project, visit my website at teachingwritingcoach.com. So we go all year long. So we'll be going during the summer months and even the vacation months. We always have something cooking. So hope you found this useful. Happy teaching, happy writing.